This is the rather strange last day in the life of John Lennon, written and read by Anthony Rotuno. This is an audio companion to the blog post, and I've put a link to the original post in the description section of this video. I will also be making embellishments and making a few interjections, adding comments, etc. as I'm reading, but it might be worth reading along. Before I start, I'm going to talk about the two principals in the case. The first one being John Lennon. Now, obviously so much has been written about John Lennon. He's one of the most famous men of the 20th century. But there are a few things that perhaps are not always told in the official story. Now, I think first and foremost in his personal life, John Lennon was a troubled man, almost from the beginning. A troubled boy who became a troubled teenager who became a troubled man. His family history is fairly well known. He grew up with an absent father who was a seaman. He grew up with a mother and an aunt who seemed to play opposite roles in his life, in that his aunt brought him up and was more of a stern disciplinarian. His mother was more like a flighty aunt and undoubtedly had a huge influence on him. She was a very free-spirited woman, sexually free-spirited as well, but I think she shaped a lot of John Lennon's more liberal attitude to life and liberal ideas, creative ideas as well. So John Lennon had a very tragic life. When he was about 12, I think, his uncle George, who was his aunt Mimi's husband, who had been a very benevolent figure to him, died. When he was 18, his mother was killed in a car crash. It was said that it was by an off-duty policeman who was drunk, but I'm not sure if that's always been verified, but it was certainly, she was killed, which obviously was a terrible blow. Paul McCartney as well lost his mother around the same time, and I think this very much deepened the bond between John and Paul. But it's interesting to see that they seem to react to the loss of their mothers in two completely different ways. John Lennon went off the rails badly for a couple of years, probably for more than that really, but particularly for the first year after she died. Paul McCartney seemed to go the opposite way and decided that he was going to charm the world. I think they both had what you would imagine the reactions would be, in that their personalities that were already underlying became, I guess, more extreme. John Lennon, in addition, had a best friend who was called Stuart Sutcliffe, who was a very talented artist from Liverpool. He was also a member of the Beatles for about 2 years, but rather tellingly, he was in mainly because he was John Lennon's best friend rather than his ability on his instrument, which was bass. And we know that for a fact because there are some very rare tapes of the Beatles rehearsing in 1960, and it's clear, you can clearly hear Stu Sutcliffe's very primitive bass style or bass abilities. John Lennon was a drug addict for a long time, and he used drugs, including alcohol, all through his adult life, which, is not totally unusual for young men, particularly creative young men in the show business world. But I think it's clear to see, and he said it himself, that you always need, quote, he always needed a drug to survive. And so he went through the full list, really. He was never an alcoholic, to my knowledge. And certainly in terms of volume, he wasn't a particularly hard drinker in the rock and roll world. But we do know that he was, quote unquote, a terrible drunk, in that it only took 2 or 3 drinks and the demon would come out. And I think all his troubles tended to come out in his behaviour when he was drinking. In 1973 to 74, he had what he referred to as Lost Weekend, which actually wasn't quite what people think it was. They think the term Lost Weekend means that he was lost from the world, but actually he took the name from the title of a 1945 film with Ray Milland about an alcoholic. So really he was referring to a period of alcoholism. And May Pang, who was his companion for a lot of this time, was actually set up by Yoko to be his companion when Yoko wanted a period away from John. May Pang actually wrote a book and talked about the frightening aspects of John Lennon's personality when he drank, and that the demons really did come out, and I don't think he ever resolved it. Those demons that were set by all this terrible loss that he had, dysfunctional family, etc., and obviously the pressures of being a Beatle and that remarkable fame as well. Now there are many biographies of John Lennon, but the two which are quite interesting to compare. One was simply called John Lennon. It was written by Ray Coleman, who was a journalist in Britain. He was pretty much a friend of John Lennon. The second one was written by Albert Goldman, called The Lives of John Lennon. It was published in 1988, so after John Lennon was killed. The Ray Coleman book, incidentally, was, I think, published in 1984, so they were both after his death. But the Goldman one was extremely controversial, made some quite outrageous claims. Goldman had previously written a book about Elvis Presley, which had attracted great controversy. But it is interesting, when the John Lennon one came out, there was a lot of uproar, and there were quotes on the back of the book from Paul McCartney and Cilla Black, among others, denouncing the book as trash and rubbish. What's interesting is that since the book has come out, there have been numerous other books written by people who knew John Lennon, and they weren't really written in the Goldman style. They weren't just out and out trashing his reputation, but they did include some pretty dark stuff, and I think John Lennon, by his own admission, was a dark character, did some very, very questionable things. But to his credit, he sought to rectify that. He said himself that it's always the most violent people who want peace. So he's then admitting that he's violent, and went the opposite way, and I think genuinely wanted peace for the world. What's the most contentious period of his life, I think, was the period from 1975 to 1980. He essentially retired from the music business in 75. Around the same time he went back to Yoko, and his son Sean was born, coincidentally on exactly the same day as John Lennon's birthday, 9th of October. Now, if you read the Ray Coleman book, John Lennon spent those 5 years rekindling his love for Yoko, raising his son, and becoming at peace with himself after his troubled life. Now, Coleman, of course, plays down a lot of the troubles that he'd had previous to that. Although the heroin addiction was well known, he tends to play it down, basically. And then in Coleman's eyes, this 5 years was idyllic, and John Lennon had finally found contentment. Albert Goldman goes exactly the opposite way and says that John Lennon spent 5 years secluded in his room. He did take holidays, he did give quite a lot of attention, perhaps too much attention, to his son, but was also prone to great outbursts of rage. And his relationship with Yoko Ono had pretty much ground to a halt. It was a celibate relationship, perhaps a relationship of convenience, you might say, and a relationship of dependency. He did used to call Yoko a mother, as I mentioned in the story that I'm about to read. And there's another book written by Fred Seaman, who was John Lennon's personal assistant. And the tone of the book really is of someone who loved John and liked him, and found it very interesting and stimulating to be his personal assistant. But then he talked about the dark stuff as well. John Lennon did have a very quick temper and quite frightening as well. And Julian Lennon, his first son, who was really neglected by his father throughout his life, talked of being very frightened by John Lennon's temper. So, he was an edgy fellow at the end of the day. I think he maybe did reconcile something with himself in those 5 years, but the evidence seems to point to the truth being somewhat nearer to Albert Goldman's interpretation than Ray Coleman's. It might be worth reading those two books so you can make up your own mind. Mark David Chapman was 25 when he shot John Lennon. He was also a troubled man, and I do make a couple of comparisons during the story. He grew up in Georgia, in the southern United States. He was a Beatles fan for a while in the 60s. He also went through a period of LSD. He went through a period of born-again Christianity. He had previously attempted to kill himself and had formed an unhealthy association, first of all, with the book The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, and with John Lennon himself. Some revisionist history has suggested that the Beatles weren't actually his favourite band, and that he was more of a fan during the heyday of the Beatles, and not particularly a Beatles fan during the 70s.